Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to the spring semester. This is the the continuing lecture series in the Center for New Art, the undergraduate art department and the graduate art department, and also sponsored by the dean and the provost. And today we have Daryl Moore with us, so thank you very much for coming. Today we're really lucky. Oh, sorry, I want to make an announcement first, too. On April 5th, we will have Marian Wilson with the M-Lab coming. Now, just to remind you what the M-Lab is, it's an RV vehicle that has a lab that has moss and other art projects in it. And she will bring it to campus at Power Art Building. And it will be there all day, so you'll be able to go into the lab, you'll be able to see it and do all that stuff. And then, of course, she'll lecture again at 2:10. And at 4:30, Cliff Baldwin, who made the House of Fub, or the Fub Pavilion, will be presenting and performing his Music of the Spheres, which is music derived from the Kepler spaceship. And he'll have a video projected against the wall of astronauts and so on, plus the music that he's performed. He's bringing 2 other people with him. So that's April 5th. 2:10 for the lecture, 4:30 for Cliff Baldwin's performance. So I hope you'll join us for that. Today, though, we're really lucky. We're really lucky to have Mary Mattingly with us. With a focus on nonviolence, Mary Mattingly creates ecosystems from existing military and industrial infrastructure. She believes art can change people's perceptions about value. After studying current supply and waste chains, she began creating interdependent living systems as both an action and a representation. She wants this work to reimagine public food, reinforce water as a human right, and co-create our shared present and future through common spaces. Mary is an artist based in New York. Her work has been exhibited in the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Kitchen International Center of Photography, the Seoul Art Center, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the New York Public Library, the deCordova Museum and Sculpture Park, and the Palais de Tokyo. She participated in smARTpower, an initiative between the U.S. Department of State and the Bronx Museum of the Arts, as artist ambassador to the Philippines. She has been awarded grants and fellowships from the James L. Knight Foundation, I-Beam Center for Art and Technology, Yale University School of Art, the Harpo Foundation, NYFA, New York Foundation for the Arts, the Jerome Foundation, and the Art Matters Foundation. Her work has been featured in Aperture Magazine, Art in America, Art Forum, Art in Auction, Sculpture Magazine, China Business News, the New York Times, New York Magazine, Financial Times, Le Monde Magazine, Metro. Oh my God, are we lucky to have this woman here presenting to us today. Thank you very much, and please welcome Mary Mattingly.
Thanks for that. That was well put. So this is just an overview of some of the living systems or ecosystems. They, like Michael said, are either based in industrial equipment or military equipment. That's how they start. And then with the help of people from all walks of life, including engineers, structural engineers to architects to artists to teachers and students, we transform them to make these new spaces that can be collaborative but also potentially homes. So they straddle the line between being public and private. And I will start just by talking about a little bit about my past. So I work with photography. I studied photography in school, and photography still is important in my work, and I think it's important in making these living systems because they're usually temporary. Ideally, they're permanent, but sometimes with temporary spaces and with temporary sculptures, you want to document them. So that's very important to the work that I do. So I look at photography as a proposal. So they can be proposals for a potential future, for a story, for as a way to enact a sculpture. I also look at them as a way to just document sculpture. So this is a project called Waterpod that I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's an ecosystem on a 100 by 30 foot flat deck barge and has everything that a person would need to live. And it's also a public space. And then lastly, photography as the sculpture. So actually just taking the photographs and bundling them into these sculptures is the last way that I use photography. And I just wanted to bring that up because we're all studying really practical majors, and for me, photography was that. It was a way to think about making a living as an artist, but still doing the art that I wanted to do. And that led me into, I think, being more and more involved in sculpture. So this is a picture from a sculpture called Pull. This is in Havana, and there were 2 spheres that, this is one of them, and we pulled them through the streets and then set them up at different locations. But the movement of pulling them was just as important as the sculpture. And then I think about sculpture as being sort of monumental. This is supposed to be a house that's sinking. So this is built on a military boat hull, and it's built with scrap from an old school, from the gymnasium, from the floor, and it houses artists. So artists live and work in this space. It also can be public when there are events. And there's enough of an ecosystem surrounding this project called WetLand that people could, in theory, make a dinner. They couldn't survive fully like the Waterpod, but it has a little bit of what a person would need. And then a sculpture as an experience. So this is, these are a couple of images of a bridge underwater. I think what excited me about this project was actually trying to get this permitted and get this insured. So there was no precedent for a bridge underwater that the insurance company could find, or the permit agency in Des Moines, Iowa. So we had to really struggle with even proving that this would be sort of like a legitimate bridge. But the point of it was really to get people to come into this river called the Raccoon River that's polluted. It's polluted from the farming industry mostly, so there are just, you can see all the nitrates in the bottom of that picture on the right. But it also floods all the time because of the way that Iowa has been engineered, the land has been engineered to basically provide enough food so the farming can be, I guess, very concentrated. In order to do that, all the excess water just drains into this river. So on an average day, this river might flood. So that was actually a challenge with the project, but also pretty wonderful to actually get people to come to the river for this event. And this is when I started really taking photography, I think, to a sculptural level. I was in school. I started school in Manchester, Connecticut at Manchester Community College. I moved to Boston to do a little bit more schooling, and then I moved to the West Coast, to Portland, Oregon, to study at a school called Pacific Northwest College of Art. And there I started to go to the desert. The desert's about 3 hours away from Portland, Oregon, and I went there because it was the year 2000, and for one thing, in the world, Bechtel, the water company, had privatized water in Bolivia, and there were giant protests in Cochabamba. And I remember reading about this and connecting it to where I grew up, where water was not safe for drinking. So I was trying to figure out how to tell a story about water that was pertinent to living in the United States and to the potential future of water in the United States. So thinking about bottled water, how we could collect water if we needed to, et cetera. So I started to make these water purification systems that I wanted to put into these suits that I called Wearable Homes. This is a picture of the desert. This is the first water purification system that is just basically made with 2-liter soda bottles, carbonated charcoal that you could make yourself, pebbles, sand, things that would clean water, and then that's a picture of the wearable home being used. So the wearable home had 3 layers, and I really started making it as a reaction to reading about what was happening in Bolivia and thinking about how we would survive in these terrains that seemed to be getting more and more extreme. So the layers included one for a desert, one for an Arctic tundra, and then one for a waterlogged space. And the idea was that you could just take one on and off as according to where you were. And these places would come up in this narrative about this future. This is on the border of Arizona and Mexico in a town called Yuma. And these things are all around. So sometimes I would insert photographs like this into a story about a future that had to do specifically with water and movement. And this is a layer of the wearable home where it's expanding for the water. So the idea was that you could kind of float. And this is a dust storm. a person using a wearable home in the water. So some of these were fictionalized, obviously. Some of the tools didn't work, but they were made to look like they worked through the photograph, and some of them did. And this is an image of 2 people using wearable homes in an Arctic area. So yeah, so that's a body of work. It took me through the year 2006. From 2000 to 2006, I worked on these narratives about potential futures as sort of proposals, but also warnings. I think what I was really worried about happening, which we're seeing now, are just more and more extreme environmental conditions and trying to live within. And then I started to, I guess after Hurricane Katrina, I started to really think about photography and what it could do. So these are collages of tourism and traumas that affect people in environmental ways. So very basically questioning, I guess, what can a photograph say? Can it tell a story that's relevant to a particular place or thing or action? And can we tell something about ourselves from it? And around this time, I think I stopped focusing on the image and really started to think about sculpture and how they could work together maybe, but also how sculpture could be more active. And I was thinking about Katrina and these environmental traumas and disasters and how we could maybe survive where we are in a different way. So I wanted to make this proposal. This is the first image of a project called Waterpod that I showed you before, where I wanted to make this structure that people could live in that was half underwater and half above. This island-like infrastructure held the sphere upright, but it also was a place to grow food. The top of the sphere collected water and had these flexible solar cells, and all for about $5,000 you could make this. That was the plan. Anyway, I took this really seriously, and I showed a bunch of people in the arts, and also I think the most interesting response I got was from Creative Time, Ann Pasternak. I don't know if you guys know that organization, but she said, if you want to do something like this, you really have to take it to the Coast Guard. So I called the Coast Guard and showed them this image and told them what I wanted to do. And while they laughed, they also sort of took it seriously, and they said, if we're interested in this idea because we have this problem with runoff, and boats in the water always let their sewage just drain right into the river. So if you could come back to us with something that's maybe, that's going to take you less time to get permitted and going to cost less money, because they had estimated this at maybe a $10 million project or something like that. And they said, so if you can do that, come back to us and we'll take you more seriously, basically. So I took that time and I took that meeting and sort of stretched it, I think. I told the Department of Education, someone had introduced me to someone from the Department of Education who was running their summer programs, and I said, the Coast Guard is really interested in this project and seeing this project happen. What I'd love to do is host some free workshops where people tell me what their Waterpod would look like and how it would function. So over the course of 6 months, I started to kind of get a group of ideas together and meet some kids who were interested in actually seeing this happen. And we started to develop a plan that was actually more realistic than what I had come up with. It ended up looking like this. Everything would be modular, still on the boat, but made with geodesic domes, which are really, I don't know if you guys know them, but do you guys know? Yeah. They're easy to put together, right? Almost anybody with 5 people can erect a dome in a couple of hours usually. So it's pretty accessible. So we ended up going forward with a design like this, and I think the thing that I just want to say about doing projects and doing artwork on the water that has been really rewarding is the fact that when you're on the water, I guess making an ecosystem on the water, you can do something on a scale that's really accessible and easy to understand. So whereas we can never really, it's almost impossible for us to understand our ecosystem that we're a part of because it's so large on land. We can have a myopic or a very expansive view of it. This is really centered on the size of the vessel. So it becomes this really magical almost space where you can see things change, and it's very apparent how for instance, your compost is affecting your garden. Something like that is pretty, I think, advantageous to doing something on the water. It's also a space where you have to collaborate, where if you're on a boat with someone else, you're pretty much fighting with nature the entire time, and it's essential that you work together. So this is the Coast Guard. So over the course of 3 years, we found out that we needed about 18 permits for each pier that we were going to dock at, and we could only dock at each pier for 2 weeks before the Waterpod's shadow, I guess, changed the ecosystem underneath the boat. So that pretty much made us move every 2 weeks, and we were able to find 12 piers we could go to and stay for that long, and then pretty much determine the length of the project. So what I had hoped would be a long-term, potentially living space or public space / living space really had its lifespan sort of set at that point. And also what I thought in the beginning was that because we were doing this on the water, it would be a commons, and it was sort of like, if you could establish your home on the commons, you pretty much could stay there, but it wasn't the case really at all. There are so many organizations and institutions that have some jurisdiction over that commons that it's really difficult to stay anywhere for any length of time. Let's see, so over the course of trying to figure out how this project would happen, I had to open up a company, so I'd open an LLC, get the insurance, work with a pro bono legal team, and get everything you could imagine permitted, including we had 4 chickens that they each needed their own permit, so if they were photographed, they would be protected. And I started to really love the document as a different form of a photograph. So I was thinking about what this could say that a photograph couldn't. Or an ink drawing, perhaps. And there's so many stories that go along with these that I'll spare you. So this is the build out of the Waterpod. It happened at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and basically we resourced all the materials from the waste stream. So some of the things that we sourced included metal, billboards. We actually went back to some of those same kids, found them again, and they were able to grow the seedlings that we ended up eating off of, art crates. We had that wood from the Parks Department. They built a temporary stage, and we got to use it afterwards. So I'll just tell you so this is what the Waterpod looked like from the outside. This is a kitchen. That's our shower. We had 4 gardens that were all vegetable gardens, annuals. We collected rain off of the kitchen shower, and then in the back there are 4 cabins. And all that rainwater from the cabins and the kitchen shower went to this 1,500-gallon tank where we stored it and then pumped it through a water purification system. We then ran we used solar panels on this roof to pump it. We ran all that water up to a holding tank over here, and then gravity fed it into the kitchen and into the shower. And then whatever water was left over, we gravity fed through a water purification or a kind of like a wetland marsh cleaning system. And that was these 3 tanks. And there's 4 tanks over here. The chickens lived back here. This is our public space, and that's our greenhouse. So we had everything that we needed to pretty much stay and live on there for probably until the winter, when we would have had a greenhouse a lot more. But our hope and our idea at the beginning was to try to figure out how we could stay on there year after year and have it be a self-sufficient ecosystem. And I'll also mention.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Did the Coast Guard fund the development of this?
No, they just basically permitted it.
Okay. And so how did you fund it?
So the funding, so we bartered for most of it to happen. And then we ended up needing to raise $20,000 for insurance, which we did through selling portfolios of my work and 3 other artists who were living on the project with me. And then we had to scramble to try to fund some other things that were kind of last minute thrown on the project. Like we needed a security guard for the entire time. And that yeah, we had a fundraising dinner. That was pretty much what we did. We had this dinner in Portfolio. I know, that's what we thought. We were like, oh, we'll be the security.
Yeah.
We're on there 24 hours. But they were, at that time, the city was really nervous about this project, and they were nervous about something going wrong. So in the end, the last 2 weeks, we decided we didn't need the security. But anyway, yeah.
Oh, so wait, you decided you didn't need it?
The last 2 weeks, we said, okay, I think we're all set. So we ended our contract with the security company early. And they were fine with that.
They didn't report you to the city.
No. Yeah, so it was strange that we had this like self-sufficient ecosystem, but we always had a security guard there. So it would always be docked too. So this is an unusual picture of it in transit. It's always at a pier, and when it was in transit, it would be towed by that tugboat. Thank you. And so when it was docked, people would pretty much come on all day and all night.
So the water, you said you purified the water primarily for drinking and eating
Yeah.
purposes, right? But, I mean, is the water good enough in the East River that you can have regular contact with it? And
We didn't use the river water, we just used rain.
I see.
But it would have been fine if people went swimming and they caught fish from the river water. I think that there's a limited amount of time you should do that for probably, but people would tell us things like, we learned a lot on this project, me and my 3 friends who ended up living on it with me. For instance, where you can catch fish at what point in time, what fish are swimming through versus being born. And so, yeah. I'm trying to think of what else to say about this project. It took me a long time to convince people to live on it with me. And that was also, I think, a part of the project that I rarely talk about is how the drama sort of unfolded living on this barge, because we were really under a microscope. Not only was the city watching us to make sure nothing went wrong, but it was like a media magnet. And I think between me and my friends, we had lots of anxieties that we didn't really know about until we lived in a small confined space together. And we were really aware of what we didn't want people to see and what we felt comfortable with people seeing, like what books we were reading, to how clean it was. All these things became anxieties, and living on a small space, you realize how myopic your point of view is. It wasn't until the few times I did leave for necessity, I realized that I was being ridiculous usually. Like, your perception really changes that fast, that I would step off of it and take the subway somewhere and realize that the world is so much bigger. And the shelf I wanted didn't matter.
I'm seeing the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Williamsburg Bridge. Where was this photograph taken from? Was it taken from another boat?
This was South Street Seaport.
Oh, South Street.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so.
It was just pulling out of the seaport. Yeah, so that was an experiment. It went from 2009, the summer of 2009 to late fall. It ended right before the winter. And over the course of the project, we had 200,000 visitors. So we were hosting people all the time. About 500 people a day came. And what we thought we would, we thought we would probably make some art about being on the water, but the whole time we were trying to keep this thing afloat, pretty much. One thing that was fascinating to me was how, in the beginning of the project, we were spending so much time keeping the living systems running. By the end of the project, we were at about 2 hours a day that we were spending keeping up all these systems that were allowing us to live. So if economically we're thinking about that, we gave up our jobs to do this. We were always thinking about the money. We're thinking about how we would, make what we needed to live versus buy it. So at the end, there were 4 of us, but we were only spending 2 hours a day doing what we needed. This is some other views. This is the kitchen, top left, greenhouse, some of the gardens, billboard covering the dome. We got a sign from the Parks Department at one point. That was the highlight. We're a temporary park. So one of the things that started happening was people started bringing things on, and which was really wonderful. Like, people would bring wine on or cheese or something like that, and sometimes complete strangers. And it's just started happening more and more. So I guess that started to make me think about art in a completely different way. I think before doing this project, I was thinking about art as a very insular activity that you did. I was doing in front of my computer more and more, and then finally I would have this image to try to engage people in this narrative that I was creating. Inspired by other things, but really a lot of it was from my head. So being able to do something so public and then to see reactions of so many people, that was really warm and welcoming, but also to learn so much from people who are coming onto this structure, I think really made me think about art in a different way. And I guess what I thought was that this was kind of a spectacle, right? It had all these elements that would just draw people to it. In a way, I thought maybe this needs to compete with the spectacle of New York City, and it has to be like, it has all these elements to sort of try to engage people and bring them in, and then start telling stories together. So I guess that stuck with me for a while, and I started to think about doing a similar thing, but I thought it would be so much easier to do something on land. So I started to just look at construction waste and the developer's plan as a site for intervention. I was thinking about the waste specifically, but also all of those crevices that are in between spaces that you could potentially put something in that could stay for a while and then move. And so I was constructing these forms. I called them flock houses, and there are 3 of them, and I kind of created this plan that I then sent to some of those same contacts at the city to see if it could, essentially these things could move around and be stages for other people's artwork. So I asked friends of friends to see if they wanted to use this for anything public, and over the course also took pictures of it being moved, or renditions that I thought could be potentially real. And then artists started to take it on as a project space. So this is my friend Scott Patrick Weiner, who's an artist based in Boston. He lived in this thing pretty much full time in the back of the Bronx Museum, in their parking lot. It was set up there, and did this postcard project where he basically stamped, had these postcards ready to be sent back to the flock house that was always moving, and then tried to see which ones would get there. And then this is Ghana Think Tank. They're an organization based in New York and Ghana, and they they send out questions, what they call first world questions, quote, to quote, third world places to get answers for them. And that's kind of been their practice for a long time. So they're like, instead of doing what the US usually does, which is tries to find solutions for other people's quote problems, they're going to try to do the reverse. And they did this project in Queens where they asked people what the police were doing that they would consider illegal actions. For instance, police would always come up and say, you can't loiter here, you can't stand here. And they would make signs saying that this is a legal waiting zone, for instance. So people used flock houses for all different things. And then it became a workshop. So it's been taken to other cities. This is in Omaha, Nebraska, where the same kind of ways of building are employed, but the materials are different according to the place. So for instance, in Omaha, there are more hurricanes and tornadoes than on the East Coast, so we built for that. And artists and groups use this place for different reasons, and they made like this expansive kind of yard for one of these. And I've reused some of those same materials. So this is a flock house set up in a different configuration for something called Triple Island. And Triple Island was a really fascinating project. It's built on the Lower East Side on a pier called Pier 42. And it was, I think, one of the, there's been an ongoing debate about public art as an advocate for real estate, essentially. So what these people did, being well aware of that, is there were 6 or 7 community groups that got together, and they got a bunch of art permits in order to sort of protect this space that was going to become a condo development, so they could galvanize enough support to actually turn it into a park. So in this liminal time zone of about 2 years, when they knew that developers were looking at this parcel of land to become a condo, and they knew that they really needed park space, they got art permits in order to sort of slow that process down and to gain enough momentum to actually keep this as a park space or as an empty space. So now it's becoming a full-blown public park, which is an interesting side note about this project. This was basically a small living system where people would experiment using it in different ways. There's a community garden on it, and then a greenhouse and a workspace. And that's it from above at the time. Now it really looks like a kind of a standard park. These are just some slides of Pull. I feel like I should ask you guys if you want me to talk about anything specific, because I have a bunch of projects in here and I'm not sure how long I have.
You have another 15 minutes.
Okay. So Pull is set up in a museum here, and this is a similar, this is a very small ecosystem where there were birds and fish involved in this, and the birds were eating the plants, and the bird droppings were kind of feeding some of the fish. And this is WetLand, which I described a little bit earlier. This is in Philadelphia, not too far, actually. And this is open to artists. So right now it's run by the University of Pennsylvania for another semester, and they're using it for student workshops around something called art in the Anthropocene, or they've basically started a new major that they're using this space as a lecture site, but also a site where students can sleep over for a couple of nights. But after that, it goes back to being an artist residency. So if anybody is interested in trying this out, these people built it out with me, and we've all become co-owners in the project. So if any one of us wants to have a living space for a time, we kind of get first dibs, but I don't think anybody wants it for a while. So right now, this is what it looks like downstairs. We use the downstairs as a studio, and then upstairs you can sort of see is like a 2-bedroom loft. And it's all off-grid too, so it's all run with solar panels and on the same kind of water filtration systems from the rain. We ended up engaging a lot of different groups in Philadelphia to do this project. When it was in its full form, it was part of the Fringe Festival, which is an interesting connection to theater there. So we built this out in public, and that sort of became, we had permission to build it out in public if we were filmed while we were building it. So that also became, I think, part of the story for afterwards about this project, that it is so reliant on some sort of theater or some sort of action that feels like art that people can recognize in order for it to be allowed to happen. So occasionally we had dinners when we did have enough food growing on the surrounding island that was surrounding WetLand. We had bees from the Beekeepers Guild, so we did workshops and stuff like that with all those participants. And that's something that, now that it's been with UPenn for the year, it's had a completely different life. Like it's a different type of lively, I guess. And this is where it was for the Fringe Festival. Okay, so this is a proposal. This is what I'm working on right now. It's called Swale, and it's a plan for a floating food forest. It's built with shipping containers that are welded shut and made to float. So they're flipped upside down, and then they're filled with 3 inches of concrete in order for them to be ballasted. And then they're just locked together in the corners. And then on top of that, we are building a platform that will house a food forest. And the difference between this and the other garden type things that I've been working on is, and what is really exciting to me about this project is that the idea of edible perennials being a long-term home for food and growing space for a very rich ecosystem is possible in a food forest. So you're only using perennials, so it's things that grow back over time, so people don't really need to care for them in the same way. And the hope is that this will be a very active, it is a symbol, but it's also supposed to be an active way to rethink the policy in New York City specifically, where it's still illegal to grow public food in public spaces. So what I mean by that is it's not illegal to have a community garden, but a community garden is usually fenced off, and usually you're only allowed to enter if you have access to that, if you pay sometimes. So this project would what we're doing at the same time as making this project is petitioning to get enough signatures to actually try to grow food in public parks in New York City. So right now, as you might have read, foraging is very contested and people do it a lot. But what if we grew all of the food, all of the plants were made to be edibles in New York? What would the city look like? How would it function? What if food was a service? So it's thinking about those questions. And this is the other ecosystem that I work with. I'll just quickly go through this. This is back to photography again. I'm thinking about where all the parts of my camera come from and the photograph that I make, for instance, where all those parts come from the film to, in this case I'm using sensors, but potentially filmed, to the paper that I'm printing on, to the inks. And I made this website called ownit.us where almost everything that I own or that has come across my, I possess, I guess is a better word, ends up on this website. And I'm trying to figure out as much information as I can about where it came from and how it was made. And if you go onto that website, you can ask me for any of those things as an MP3 or a PDF or a 3D model. And then I started to bundle all those things. So I wanted to make sculpture from these things. I think to talk about the excess of the things that I have as a reflection of just our society in general and consumption in general. But really, I became just so amazed with all the stuff that I had. And I think I'm still in shock. Now I have 7 of these bundles. They're always in and out of my studio, and they're just massive mounds. They're impossible to do anything with, like to move, to lift. So I think I wanted to create a symbol, but it became like the bane of my existence pretty much. I don't know.
And you can't use any of those things anymore.
And I can't use any of those things anymore. And there have been times when I've desperately wanted a sweater. So I traced that, and this is the jute that makes the bundles. And it's been a long photo project, and it's really full of contradictions because I'm still using the photographs that I'm not sure I should be. And trying to tell these stories about consumption and stuff, and the final days, the burial, potentially. So the burial of the stuff can be, I think, this is probably my favorite photograph from this body of work, where it really, I hope, gives reverence to each of those things and to all of everything, the lives, the environment, everything that surrounds all these objects, everyone who surrounds all these objects to make them come alive, right? So how can we have as much respect for them continually as they deserve? And the minerals. This is a video. I'm going to skip it though. This is what I've been working on for a while. I'm still working on it. I wanted to get it down to everything being in bundles except for what I could carry, what I really needed. So this is really, I guess, bordering more on the absurd than practical, you could say. I guess since then, I've been working on, I think the question that I've been trying to pose is what happens when we take objects of trauma and transform them with people. So that's what I'm trying to look at here. And this is a workshop at the Museum of Modern Art where we're transforming this military trailer into a social space. And I'll leave it there. Do you guys have questions? I know I went through a lot really fast.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
I think one of the things that's so interesting about your work is that it's both new and fresh, but it also calls back to previous works and previous movements and times from other places, And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that. Do you have antecedents or people that you really admire, you really, kind of set you on your path, guided you a little bit? Maybe not even anybody you knew, but somebody you read or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe most pertinent to this work that I showed would be Buckminster Fuller, who I studied for a long time. And I think also there's an anxiety about him in this work where I do really admire the geodesic dome and lots of the engineering concepts that he's come up with and the way that he lived, and a lot of what I've read. I think what's been frustrating is to think about that back to the land movement as something that's so separatist. And what's been really a fascinating challenge is to think about how some of that work that he did could be maybe more integrated into everyday life and into an urban space, and what could happen from that. So I guess I think about the Black Mountain College a lot, and I think about those people. I don't know, there are a lot of references that, you know, I studied Dorothy Day for a while, and I see her coming back in this work.
I also feel like Meryl
Euclides.
Euclides, yeah, right? That's really interesting here. The other thing I think is what's interesting is that you've forged this relationship with the city, right? I mean, none of this, even the Coast Guard stuff, wouldn't have happened without this relationship with the city.
Yeah.
How's that been? I mean, you're an artist. Artists are supposedly free spirits. They don't have anything to do with bureaucracies and cultures, and yet there you are, kind of chipping away at the edifice. How's that been for you as an artist?
I guess I think about that especially with the Waterpod, because I really got to know so many people in those different pockets of the government. But I guess I found it so ridiculous. It's kind of like doing the Bundle Project, where you think every day I would get another email, oh, you also need to do this, and it would be like a Herculean task. And it just became so funny that I think I had this momentum that I was going on that was like, oh, now we need to hire a security guard, or oh, now we need to fill out these 20 different permits or something like that. So I think that there was a level of humor that now is lacking, because I've been through that. And I don't know, I feel like you need to be that engaged with it and try to understand and recognize that it's still absurd. And there's a reason for all those things too. So I think that just the learning part of it has been really engaging for me.
I know that. If anybody else has questions, please, I'll pass them off. But I find your presentation so interesting. I wonder, is there something wild about what you do, or is it a displaced social structure? I'm just kind of interested in, because it's not organized the way a city is organized, and you don't have governance, and you don't have all these. I didn't seem like you had rules, very many rules for being on the boat and stuff like that. But so, do you see it as a wild endeavor, or do you see it as a displaced domestic endeavor, or are you projecting into the future? And it's I'm just kind of.
Oh, that's interesting. I could see it. I haven't thought about it as displaced domestic, but it could very well be. You might be reading more into it than I have. I guess I've thought about it as a potential hopeful future. So if we could be more interdependent in cities and, not replicate these things, but think about how if each of us was growing some food we could share, for instance. Like how much we could do if we were all doing a little bit of making living systems possible, so we could then, I guess, be less reliant on global supply chains. I think about that a lot. As far as community structures, I have had enough experience through these projects to know that co-ownership feels really good right now. But on the Waterpod, it was definitely, we tried to have a non-hierarchical structure, and that worked for about a day, maybe less. And there was so much frustration with it, with just no one feeling like they had the authority to do anything, pretty much, and that a boat was sinking while we were like contemplating. But
You guys got some questions? We have to speak into the microphone so it's on
Okay.
the tape.
You mentioned with the second boat project that there was something about how it was art itself that kept it working, that seeing it as art allowed people to know what to do with it somehow.
the
I was wondering
theater.
if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so for that second boat project, we had permission from the city through the Fringe Festival, which is a theater festival all over the world, but big in Philadelphia, I guess. And so we had theater events that were held on this, but we also needed a place to build out at the last minute. And because someone put two and two together and they're like, well, you can't really build in this public space, but if you call it art, then you can get away with it. And if we train our security cameras on the boat, then it can look like performance art or theater. And so we desperately needed a place to build, so we said okay. But the whole time we were thinking, yeah, this is theater. Like we're building this art project, but it's more about the theater of us building than, like, some of us don't even know what we're doing. Or a lot of us are learning, and so there was a learning curve to building, but it also was necessary that it be some sort of theater. And I think that's really useful. I think that when doing art in public, it seems to be advantageous to think about those loopholes and how those could affect other things. So when we did the Flockhouse project, it was right after Occupy Wall Street, and the rules drastically changed during that project. So first we're going to be able to live in these spheres, and then after Occupy Wall Street, they were like, there's no way you're going to be allowed to stay overnight. But in a few places didn't say that, and then we were kind of wondering what would happen later. Like maybe that would be the loophole for occupiers to then camp out in that place or something like that. And I think that can happen. That happened with Waterpod as far as finding the permit trail or something like that. That needs to be done. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting part of art in public.
So what type of and so you worked with the city, but were there any like city art institutions that you worked with to like Center for the Cultural Council?
Yeah.
Any of who helped with
Different ones. So for at the time in 2009 for the Waterpod, they had the mayor's office of citywide events, and we worked with them as well as the Department of Cultural Affairs. And for the flock houses, we worked with the Parks Department and the Department of Transportation. But I think that the DCA, the Department of Cultural Affairs, in the city is usually, in New York City is usually the way to go, because they can always lead you to whatever other agency you might need to go to. As far as in Philadelphia, they have, I think it's also called the Department of Cultural Affairs or something really similar. And that's what we did too.
So did you have do they have like forms you go through, or do you have a lawyer with you? How do you navigate this system?
You can email them. That's what I did for the Department of Cultural Affairs. They have email contacts that would be, I think, more direct than the forms. There might be forms, but I don't think so. It's because they're so specific for certain things. So if you wanted to propose sort of like a painting on a wall, then there's probably a form for that. But the less, I think, usual it is, the more you just probably want to email them or call them.
Do they help with funding, or is that you come to them and then you have to bring your
They never did for me.
Got it.
But they do have things that you can apply for that are funded. But I think the way that I've found them most useful to work with is if you don't say that you need funding and you just need help like navigating how to do something in a public space. Otherwise, you're like down further on their list of, they're like, oh, this person can do this for free. But
one of the other things that I think is really interesting and notable about your work is that you're blending fictions and fact things and future projections, and you're kind of blending all these things together. Like particularly the I forgot the name of the movable house, or what was that called?
the flock house?
No, not the flock house. The clothing.
The wearable home.
The wearable home. The wearable home. So that is a particular place. Maybe not all the technology exists or whatever, or maybe it's a prototype, or maybe it's even a proposal for a prototype. And I think that's kind of an interesting place, because as artists, we sometimes don't have the resources to create all the solutions. Plus, we also don't know if it'll even work or not. And so you're kind of out there, but at the same time, out there there's a vulnerability to doing that kind of thing, and yet at the same time you have a fiction involved. So I'm kind of interested in that place between the fiction and the real. That's
I don't even know. The lines are so blurred. Everything I said was a lie. I'm just kidding. No, I think that I think it's wonderful to be able to rethink after you do something that you feel like it's finished, and then to be able to go back in and try to understand it in different ways. And I do that through photo mostly and collage. But
that's
yeah, it's
a
like another
natural-
chance.
That's a natural process for an artist, don't you think? And
Yeah.
what's interesting about yours is that, you know, it's about reality. The subject is about reality.
Right.
How are we going to live? How is it going to happen? How will it play out? And yet at the same time, you've managed to bring in light and delightful and serious things as well.
Mhm.
And you know, I think a lot of artists struggle with that. Like, well, what do I do? I don't have money to go develop a prototype or something like that. And yet you did it through a work of imagination in a way, you know?
Yeah, I think the money question is huge. And I think the only way that these projects happen, I think, especially doing the Waterpod, which gave me enough, I think, experience to be able to go fundraise, which now it's still really difficult, but I can believe that I can do at least, and before I could not believe that I could do it, was to think about all the networks of friends and potentially collaborators that we already have, and how if we work together we could build something. And I think that that's an easier hurdle to overcome. It's easier to try to understand that, yeah, I know my brother Jimmy is a builder, and you know, with his help we could do something that's a lot more than I could do by myself.
You guys got any questions? Okay, thank you very much. Really nice.
Thanks, thank you.